This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. Senate Committee Room, 1300. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. Senate Committee Room, 1300. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. Senate Committee Room, 1300. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. Senate Committee Room, 1300. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. Senate Committee Room, 1300. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. Senate Committee Room, 1300. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. Senate Committee Room, 1300. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. Senate Committee Room, 1300. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. Senate Committee Room, 1300. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. Senate Committee Room, 1300. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. Senate Committee Room, 1300. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. Senate Committee Room, 1300. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. Senate Committee Room, 1300. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. Senate Committee Room, 1300. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. Senate Committee Room, 1300. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. Senate Committee Room, 1300. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. Senate Committee Room, 1300. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. Senate Committee Room, 1300. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia.
Good afternoon and welcome to our third and final Virginia Military Survivors and Dependents Education Program Select Committee meeting. Actually, we have a very robust agenda in front of us. We are going to hear from JLARC, because JLARC did a rather thorough investigation of the program. They, of course, have made presentations already to the JLARC committee, and the report has been public. We also are going to hear from our staff, our Senate Finance staff, and they're going to briefly go over our 3 meetings that we've had, this being the third, and some of the, just to remind us of some of the presentations that we heard, and the information that was gathered. This committee has done very good work in reaching out to stakeholders and trying to objectively gather as much information as possible. We also will be providing for public comment at this meeting. Public comment must be in person or in writing. We aren't taking virtual comment today. I will ask that speakers sign up, and each speaker will be limited to 3 minutes. But in addition to the opportunity to speak in person, you may submit written comments, and you may submit those comments anytime from now through November 12th. And I don't know if we have a time period there. That's not in my notes. I will ask April for the time, the sort of last minute deadline for November 12th for accepting the comments, and please explain how members can provide the written comment.
Madam Chair, we left it open for the entire day on November 12th, so it'll be midnight on November 12th. And the link is on the agenda that's posted for this meeting, so you can go there and submit it, and it'll be sent straight to us for us to share with the chair and others, which she'll explain. But long story short, it should be open now, and it's open till midnight on November 12th.
Thank you, Katie. And as Katie mentioned, all comments submitted in writing will be shared with all members. And lastly, I will just note that this committee will not be issuing a report. We feel that the JLARC briefing and the information we've gathered through our meetings has been fairly comprehensive, and much of it speaks for itself. So I'm going to go ahead and start our agenda, our formal agenda. Justin Brown is with us, and Justin is the Senior Associate Director for the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission. And welcome, Mr. Brown. We'd like you to go over the JLARC study on this program.
Happy to do that. Thank you, Madam Chair, for the nice introduction. And let's see, we've got the slides up, so we're ready to go. As you said, this was something that we presented a couple of times, and so I'm going to go through some of this a little more quickly, but please stop me if you have questions as I go through.
And Mr. Brown, are you willing to take questions as we go along?
Please do. No, just interrupt
Okay.
me. Yeah.
Colleagues, if you do have questions, please let me know. You know how to do that, so that I can call on you. The speaker's willing to entertain questions during the presentation. Go ahead, Mr. Brown.
Happy to do that. So this is just a reminder in terms of the JLARC role in this. We were directed to do this by a letter, and our commission subsequently directed us to do this review. I won't go through all this, but I did want to just say that we assigned I think a pretty darn good team to this, and we're able to cover a lot of ground in the time we had. So this just lays out kind of who we talked to and the research we did on other states. This slide just shows we basically tried to grab every data point we could get about this particular program and state government and review that. So for our commission membership at the meeting when we released this, we wanted to provide a lot of background to the members who maybe haven't been as involved in this issue. But for this particular group, obviously you've already gotten quite a bit of information. So I'm going to go through some of this background very quickly. But obviously the active duty and veteran presidents is just critically important here in the Commonwealth, and I think we all know that and appreciate that. We also wanted to just remind our members, and this is something that has been pointed out to me by the folks who care about this program a lot, that the code kind of authorizes the commissioner to enter into a compact with veterans, and that is something that we wanted our members to be aware of as well. This is just background on how the actual program works. I'm assuming you're familiar with that by now. This is the eligibility criteria that is in statute. DVS is the one that determines eligibility. And it was interesting kind of getting into this, having not looked at it before. This is a program that's been around in some form or fashion for many years. It's obviously been expanded over time. Historically, there weren't really any general funds provided to the program, but obviously, due to your work, that changed recently. This is just an overlay of some of the major program changes going back a ways, but there were some before this. And you can kind of see how the enrollment levels start to tick up. And I'll have some more on this later, but I think you've been briefed on some of the program increases recently. This just reminds you of the legislative history here, as you well know. And I did want to just make kind of a conceptual public policy point to you. I do think, just as someone who thinks a lot about public policy, the provision of general funds here was a key step. I think if this is a benefit that the Commonwealth is going to provide, I think it's a great benefit to provide, but having some taxpayer contribution to that seems philosophically aligned to me. So I think that was an important step to start to do this. So there's been, I think, some information out in the public domain about the trends also, and I think you've gotten some presentations before, Madam Chair, about this. But obviously we know enrollment has been growing recently. This is just the 4 years and the 2 years. One thing that was kind of interesting to us is just the different rates of enrollment growth depending on the institution. It's more than tripled at some places. It's up nearly sixfold at some places. So it's gone up everywhere, but to varying degrees. Just in terms of where the growth in enrollment has occurred, it's generally the larger schools where the majority of the enrollment is happening now. I think it's important to put this growth in context. It has grown quickly, but particularly at some of the institutions at the bottom of this chart, it's a pretty small percentage of enrollment. But then at the upper end of the chart, you get up to some places where it's 4.5%, 5% of enrollment. So that varies as well. And some of that's just based on the size of the school, but some of it's based on the size or how many VMSDEP participants are at the school. I do want to just make a point. We, as I said, obtained data from SHEV and DVS in each institution and really scrubbed it pretty well. We just didn't see anything materially off in this information. I know there's some concerns about that, but from our perspective, where there have been differences, there's an explanation for that difference, and I can go into that if you have more questions. But big picture, I think some of the enrollment data that SHEV has put out is accurate. I think that's important to understand. So one of the things that we use the the data that we obtained for was to just try to provide kind of a snapshot of who right now and maybe recently has been participating in the program. And this is just some basic demographic information, just comparing VMSDEP participants to other higher education students. This shows that the vast majority of participants are undergrads. What's interesting is the proportion of those taking graduate courses has started to tick up recently. It's doubled over the last decade. And so it's about 11% of the enrollment and about 13% of the financial impact of the waiver. It was really good to be able to work with DVS on this, and they're very cooperative. There was one issue that there's been some system migrations, and there's a couple things about the data that's available now where there's a few blind spots, and so I'll talk about that as I go through. But what we did was take kind of the data that was available and as a snapshot in time to just get a basic sense of kind of who's in this program. I think not surprisingly, most of the participants are the child of a veteran or a spouse. Spouses are 15% as of the last, let's say August 23 to July 24. Now, recently, very few of the participants are eligible due to being killed or missing in action. And so nearly all of the eligibility is related to disability. And you can see here that kind of breaks down in terms of the proportion that at the time were rated 90% disabled or the percentage that were rated 100% disabled. Just wanted to show a little bit of data about disabled veterans. And I believe that the Governor's Task Force Senator's staff rightly asked about using 70% as a threshold area, which was an important question. We're just using this to kind of provide a sense, but to be transparent about this, the disability threshold for VMSDEP is 90. The only thing that's publicly available from the federal government is the 70%. So this was just to provide a sense, but it is different. I think that's an important clarification. So the other thing that is kind of interesting, and we had to kind of impute this, but we feel pretty confident about this number. Service-related disability has been a pretty quickly growing category here. So as of the last number of years, 2/3 of those eligible have a combat-related disability, but that non-combat number is rising pretty quickly. Oh, maybe that was the wrong slide. I'm sorry. So residency, this is where there were some issues with the data. There's just some missing dates and missing information about quite a few veterans' eligibility in terms of residency. So we looked at the veterans where there is data, and it's about 2/3 were eligible by entering service in Virginia, and the remaining 1/3 met that 5-year requirement prior to applying. So let's talk a little bit about kind of the financial impact of this waiver on the institutions. So when we started this, we talked to some stakeholders, and I think they have a valid perspective in the sense that from an individual participant's perspective, that impact or the cost, if you will, to the institution is marginal. And they would make the case that you have some institutions that are kind of losing enrollment, so there's available seats. And I think if you're talking about particularly a single participant, there is some merit into that. What was interesting, though, when we kind of pivoted it over and started interviewing the institutions, they really talked about this as kind of a budget issue, and we use this term foregone revenue. But the way they talk about it, it's not really about cost when you get a lot of people enrolled. It's about the waiver being revenue that they otherwise would have collected but did not. Now, what's complicated about this is how that foregone revenue affects each institution. It really depends on which school you're talking about. If you're a really selective institution and you have a lot of out-of-state students who are paying more than the cost, and let's say you don't have a very high percentage of your enrollment coming from VMSDEP participants, that's kind of on the one end, and that's a pretty low impact. But if you're maybe a less selective institution or an access institution and you don't have as much financial reach back, as this becomes a larger part of your student body that you're not collecting revenue for, that becomes, I think, a trickier issue for some of these schools. But we did try to push each of the institutions to really quantify the impact of this, because there's been some discussion about kind of how much is tuition going up because of this program. And as it turns out, that analysis just really isn't there to be done in a methodologically valid way. as I mentioned, institutions really think about this as a budgeting issue. So they have all these revenue sources and all these spending categories, and they kind of just put all this on the table at the same time. And this middle bullet just shows when we ask them the different levers they said they pulled to try to make everything fit. So it's a blend of several things, but quantifying that impact, particularly of the VMSDEP waiver on other students' tuition, is just very difficult to do in a way that you can rely on. One thing I wanted to, when we made the JLARC presentation, just kind of remind them from a fiscal side, kind of how we got here. So if we go back to FY23, that's the prior year, before you started providing general funds. And in that year, this shows the dollar amount of the waived VMSDEP tuition fees, and it puts it in the context of the tuition revenue at each school. And again, you can see big differences in terms of the percentage of revenue. But up near the top, it's becoming a fairly sizable portion of their total tuition revenue. So then if you move into the next year, and this is just a reminder, the General Assembly and the governor used 22-23 enrollment data as a way to estimate the general funds that would be provided. And that was a totally reasonable thing to do and the best information available at the time. And Chev, when we did this work, it's been a little while, but they were in the process of starting to allocate that money to the schools. I don't know where they are now with that, but they had started that process. And as you can see, if we were to take those dollar amounts and kind of apply them to the 22-23 year, the waiver amounts provided the waiver amounts line up pretty well with the general funds you provided. But the issue I think that you have is the program's growing pretty quickly here. So there's gaps in terms of the general funds that are provided and the fiscal impact of the waiver there, and it depends on the school. So maybe just a final point about waiver amounts. We did some things statistically kind of with the waiver amount data. And there's been some concern about kind of that waiver impact is being inflated, or for example, everyone's being counted as a full-time student. And when you look at the data, that's not true. We just had an example here for VCU. I think maybe we just lost our slides. Oh, hi, Jonathan. Okay. So I will just pause there. Okay, we're back up. So I'll just continue here. So also wanted to remind the JLARC members that if you go back to 2019, there were some pretty substantial changes made to the program eligibility. And in hindsight, the fiscal impact for that ended up being pretty far off. It's never possible to get it exactly right, but the fiscal impact statement probably gave at least some members a false sense of the eventual fiscal impact of these changes. So one thing we kind of told our members, and I think particularly for committee chairs, to the extent something like this comes up again, we can be a second opinion on fiscal impact reviews, and happy to do that moving forward. I'm sorry, fiscal impact statements. But in terms of data, I do think it's important when a program is growing quickly to try to get the most recent information you can when you think about the budget, when you go into the legislative session. So, Chev historically puts out data as required by statute that's kind of for the prior year. And if the program's not growing that quickly, it's actually not that big of a problem. But one idea we had was to kind of have DVS and Chev coordinate, because right now no one really owns this program in the executive branch. So to kind of have them coordinate to give the governor perhaps, but certainly the legislature, a little bit better, more real-time information. So for example, as of, let's say, November of each year, how many people have been kind of deemed eligible by DVS but haven't used the program yet? And I think Chev could probably have the institutions give them the fall enrollment data that wouldn't be perfect, but it'd be better than relying on information that's a year out of date. So we had a recommendation, I guess kind of think of it as a good government recommendation for, we had this to be legislative action, but this is something that if everyone agrees to do it, I think there's just a way to get the legislature some better information before you go into each session.
Thank you, Mr. Brown and colleagues. And members of the audience, I will ask Senator Rome at a later date in our agenda to actually explain what our drafting DLS has come back with regarding the recommendation you're suggesting. We think that this is a better coordination and more information. It's got to help all of the stakeholders with this program. So at a later date, a later time, I'll call on you. Thank you, Mr. Brown.
So normally with something like this, we would try to put out a growth estimate for the legislature to kind of have. And frankly, we tried a lot of things and struggled with this. Sometimes what you do when you're doing these estimates is you look at how a program has grown recently and you just kind of nudge that into the future. But that first bullet there just talks about how kind of disruptive, frankly, the trend has been. So you had some changes in eligibility. You had the pandemic that clearly affected higher education enrollment patterns. So I'm not sure using what has happened before is the best approach. But what's interesting is the Department of Veterans Affairs puts out information on this. There is some census data that could be used. But what you don't know is kind of the intentionality part of this. So is a child going to use the benefit? Where will they use the benefit? When will they use the benefit? So it's just a hard program to really get a handle on. And I think what's complicating here, and I thought someone spoke fairly eloquently about this at the governor's task force meeting about which of these trends may hold. But if you look at the veteran population, that is declining and has been declining. What's tricky, though, is if you look at the percentage of people that are being rated 100% or 90% disabled, that's growing. So the challenge is which of these trends is going to prevail. It's kind of hard to know. But the best conclusion we can make right now is that when we look at the evidence, it's hard to say that participation is peaking or that's going to decline, but it could. It's just hard for us to tell, and a lot of that is because of those factors that I've mentioned. So the rest of this is just going to go through the options we had. And I think as we've rolled this out, there's been some concern about a couple of things. One of the things is how have we thought about when to make a recommendation or when to make an option, but also this notion of the request letter we got talked about sustainability. And our notion for that was frankly just a math equation, which was you can control the funding side and you can control the participation side. So the way we interpreted sustainability was that in general, over the long term, the amount of general funds provided basically kind of accounts for the foregone revenue impact of the waivers. It was really as simple as that. The other piece that I did want to make clear is we have kind of a longstanding JLARC policy for when we make a recommendation and when we make an option. And the reality is when you look at kind of how other states handle this, the legislature has a lot of discretion about how to think about this. So we really felt like these were options that were best left up to elected officials, in this case, the governor and the General Assembly. So we have a lot of options here, but I think on the one hand, that gives you some flexibility, but on the other hand, it doesn't really tell you exactly what to do. The other thing I will say before I go through these is we did take a pretty deep dive on other states that had similar programs, and we did use that to structure a lot of what we proposed as options. So you'll see that as we go through. Now, one thing I wanted to just pause on for a moment, I think quite a few other states provide a type of program like this, and there are some things that are in that Virginia does that are very common when you look at these other state programs. Nearly all of them offer an education benefit if the veteran was killed in action. Almost all of them provide something if it's a service-related condition. All states provide a benefit to children. There was some discussion early on about could we think about means testing this program. Nobody does that. So I just wanted to make that case that that's really not something that's done for these types of programs. We tried a variety of things to engage with people who may have something to say about this program. And I will tell you, it was a little bit bumpy when we tried to kind of do that. But I did want to bring forth some quotes from people, in this case, who really made compelling cases. And you've heard testimony about this in prior meetings, how important this program is to them and to their family and to the Commonwealth. And I think that's an important thing to understand in terms of the sustainability of this program. But here, these are just some quotes that people put on the survey that we had. So from the notion of sustainability, we told our membership that you could appropriate enough each year to cover the fiscal impact of this program. You could also keep the level of general funds now that you're providing, but maybe think a little bit differently about how SCHEV allocates that across. You could do it based on enrollment, which is basically how SCHEV is doing it now, but you could also go back to that concept of institutions have different financial reach back, and maybe there's a way to kind of provide it in somewhat of a different way to schools based on some ability to pay factors, and we'd be happy to help think that through if there's interest in that. Early on, folks really commended that we look at the Texas program, and the Texas program is an interesting one for a variety of reasons, but Texas has a fund. What's interesting here, though, the way that it's structured in recent years, that covers about 15% of the cost of the program, and the institutions absorb the rest of the cost. I believe they created this with oil and gas revenues a long time ago, but it's a fund that provides some investment income annually, and so that is something that I think could be a model, but the Texas program doesn't cover all of it. Yes.
It's a partnership, which is nice.
That's right.
I guess the universities may not think it's a 50-50 partnership, and it's not based on the revenue that the Texas state puts in. Do you have any evidence that the universities do not welcome or robustly reach out to those who might be eligible for the Veterans College Benefit Program, because most of the cost is actually is expected to be thrown to the university? What impact does that have?
In Virginia or Texas?
In Texas.
I'm not sure do we know anything about that? I'm looking at my folks that we may have something in a note about that. And if we have that, I'd be happy to give that to you. But the point would be that if an institution is going to have to kind of absorb a sizable percentage, is it in their interest to kind of promote this program? I don't know the answer to that. There's maybe something with the centralization of how the Texas program thinks. It's a little... So, that's a good point. If there's any folks online, with the commentary was, maybe we have somebody that knows. Okay, yeah.
My daughter actually used this. I went on deployment from Texas. I'm sorry.
No, please come back here.
If you have information to add.
Yeah,
you are
my daughter actually used this program. I deployed from Texas, so that first category of being a deploying from, my daughter lived in Texas and was able to go to school there. This program is incredibly well publicized throughout everywhere. In the Virginia, the program is publicized through a bunch of glossies at all the universities. So I think the Texas program is better publicized than the Virginia program, but they're both equally available, and there's not like a way to hide them so people aren't aware of that, if that was your question.
Yes, that was a large part of my question.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you do have any
We'll look.
official information, I know that was sort of anecdotal, but questions?
No, we'll look. Yeah, happy to do that.
Colleagues, Senator Rome and then Senator DeStefano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, a question here would be, the way I'm interpreting this goes back to like one of the first meetings of our work group where I discussed the viability of basically a dedicated revenue stream, right? I have unsuccessfully tried to have general fund excess dollar, or basically budget surplus dollars for general public, be dedicated for transportation safety, right? And we've had we have a couple items that are currently part of this where it's like stormwater or storm quality, or it's environmental fund, and then we've got the reserve, we got rainy day funds that are dedicated from that. At the same time, in transportation, we do have dedicated funding streams all throughout how we do transportation funding. I was wondering the way that this was written was basically, hey, let's look at the Texas model, but is there, even though there's not a formal JLARC recommendation, is there something from here where you could say like, hey, if you did blank percentage of a budget surplus in any given year, you could dedicate to this and make it match. Do you all have a sort of figure or some sort of idea that we could then use as legislators to more or less discuss, go back and forth on, and see if we can find an agreement on?
I think we can provide that for you. What's hard is, I mean, you illustrated it very well. There's some things in certain functions of government where it's earmarked to send it and where it's not. But I think certainly in years where there's very large revenue surpluses, we can provide some maybe couple different scenarios of if the surplus is this and if it's invested at a particular, because we have oversight over the retirement system and the college savings plan. So we can kind of look at some of what they're able to do with some near-term obligations and maybe apply a return factor to that. We'd be happy to provide that.
It's an interesting point. She's trying to grow the fund, and of course, we could come up with an amount, and the universities may still be expected to put something in, but it is an interesting point. Yes, Senator Rome.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to follow up on that would be, it would be good to know at least the ballpark of how much money the state general fund would be, or like, so our general fund would be needed maybe I need to rephrase this. How much of that budget surplus would be like a minimum request or requirement in order to make this work, right? So I have tried to do it on a percentage basis, but let's say if you have just random number, let's just say, oh, we have a $100 million budget surplus. We have significantly more than that right now, but let's just say if we had that, if we had used the 1% model, it's $1 million would then be dedicated to this. 10% model, which is what I tried to do with Virginia Highway Safety Improvement Program, then you have $10 million going to this. And considering that the program's growth right now is well exceeding that number, as the current budget we've now dedicated over the biennium, 120 million, I think it is. Yeah. So I'm pretty much trying to figure out, all right, do we need to set aside 10%? So it's a 10 million. Do we need to set aside a full 50% to get up to that? Or is it just simply any time that Commonwealth revenues are in excess of blank amount of money, $40 million from surplus funds shall be dedicated to provide for this program?
I think we can give you some things to work with on that. And we just to say this, we did some math, and you're onto this with your question. Unless it's a very large amount of money, I do think at the current program level, you still would have to provide some annual general funds. But then you have to do this, how long are the obligations for? And you can try to get some big returns and drain the fund quickly, but you probably don't want to do that. So there's a balance in terms of expectations. But I think we can give you some things to maybe shoot at on that. Be happy to do that. Okay, we can do both, yes.
Okay, thank you, Senator Rome. Senator DeStep.
Sorry. So Madam Chair, if I may, I had one quick question. So under option number 1, you had said that the funds were allocated. So I think you were inferring that the funds that we received in July were already allocated, correct?
Well, so there's some nuance to this, and I don't know if anyone's here from Chev. So there was 2 pots of money that was allocated. So there was $20 million that was considered base funding for each fiscal year. And so when we did this work, I touched base with Chev, and they were in the process of allocating that $20 million kind of proportionally based on enrollment. But I believe, and luckily we have the people here who can tell us on this, but there was a 45 that was contingent on state revenues, and I believe there's a separate process to allocate that. So I do not know if that has already occurred. It may have. I'd be happy to check, but there was kind of 2 components to that, if that makes sense. But the process had started for at least the 20.
Yeah, and just a quick follow-up, Madam Chair. Sure. So what we're saying is, in July, before we saw the fall numbers, that we allocated the funding that was supposed to be allocated for fall without ever seeing the numbers of who, how many, and just I'm assuming that there was an assumption that, hey, ODU had this many students, this university had this many students, so we just did it on previous
I think that's right. I have some information from Chev that I can check, but
If you
I think
could
they just
share
took a
that.
proportional number that might have been a year old. But I will check on that, or maybe one of the money committee staff know. But
Madam Chair, if you,
that's entirely
if,
possible.
if you don't mind, if you could just share that with us. And then also on slide 48, I think it was, 48, if we can get the matrix that you used when you compared that, that would be very beneficial. When we looked at the other states of what we're doing for VMSDEP and what they're doing, we could get that matrix, that comparison matrix, that would be fantastic.
Happy to do that. And we have a, I don't know if you have this in your packet, we had appendices at the end that do that, but that may have not made it into your packet. So I will make sure you have that. It's by there's eligibility category and program characteristic, but if that's not in there, I'll make sure you get that.
Wendy,
Slide
can-
95, maybe?
And staff may have did you have something you wanted to add, Wendy?
Madam Chair, Senator DeSteff, we can't answer about the allocation, and we do see that we have Chev in the room as well to be able to answer that, but I don't have a response for the second question. But regarding the allocations of the 20 million that Justin mentioned, those are in the base budget. The 45 is part of excess revenues that I believe have to be allocated when we get to the next session. I think we're working through DPP with that, appropriated. But Chev had done their calculation based on prior enrollments, and because I think there's a JLARC slide that shows that there's increased enrollment for the upcoming year, that it did surpass what the estimates were for the prior year. I can't remember what slide that is on, but you had already projected for this year that each institution was above that amount that's been estimated.
Does that sound right? I mean, I don't know if there's anything you want to add, but Chev did what was reasonable. That's all they had at the time. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that. But yeah.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, I'm Lee Andes at Chev. Yes, as has been stated, there's really two parts to these funding of 20 million was base funding immediately available July 1st, and we knew we needed to get those funds out to the institutions as quickly as we could. We ran a couple of funding scenarios we vetted those through some stakeholders, and we landed on the pro rata using the FY23 costs or numbers for the program. So, since the General Assembly had based our 65 million, it seemed on FY23 usage, it seemed like that was the intent, was to allocate those funds that way. The other 45 million, we've been in contact with Department of Planning Budget, and we were notified there's some procedural things that need to take place. They told us the earliest window for those funds to be available would be right about now. It was like the first week in November. So I anticipate the next week or two we should see some movement on being able to disperse those funds as well. If we had attempted to match up a pro rata on FY25 current year, that would have significantly delayed the funding to the institutions till we get some hard numbers. Even this late in the year, the numbers are still somewhat fluid, as we will see students found eligible all during the year. So there was a decision to make that looked like the 65 million was based on FY23 numbers. We'll honor that intent. If we waited for this year, we could have this year's numbers, but would have delayed disbursement of those funds. And we knew clearly that 65, all the institutions are going to be above that FY23 number for
Right.
24.
Right.
And
I
Madam Chair,
understand. Yes.
I'm sorry,
Senator
if we
DeSteff.
could just get that, if you could share that spreadsheet with us of how that $20 million was distributed, and then the methodology behind it, that would be fantastic.
Absolutely. Happy to do that.
Thank you, sir. Thank you,
Okay.
Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Brown, you may continue. Okay, we really understand option one.
No, this is good.
Go ahead.
That's why we did it.
Or
So,
option two, yes.
Okay, so we talked about kind of the funding side of the sustainability equation. So now let's talk about the other side, and these would be kind of changes to the eligibility or the requirements or the benefit itself. One thing we felt compelled to just, and I think you all have heard this in some of the prior meetings, to the extent that changes will be made to the program, thinking carefully about when those changes are effective is important. We heard in our interviews and our survey work that it's important to do that, and I think there's some maybe minor changes that may not need to be significantly delayed, but major changes probably do or should be. People have kind of built their plans around this program, and just need to think carefully about the effective date of changes. We also just want to give a reminder to our members that if and when there's changes contemplated, they really can affect institutions differently on the administrative side. We had some other higher education work going on this year as well. And when you talk to different schools, either financial aid offices or bursars' offices or registrars' offices, the kind of level of administrative capacity really varies. So there's some potential changes that could be made to the program that would actually be kind of difficult for some of these smaller schools to pull off administratively, whereas some can just kind of press a button and get it done. So we just wanted to bring that to everyone's attention as well. Okay, so in terms of some of these other states' comparisons, one of the things that when we kind of did the rack and stack that we noticed was it's fairly common for other states to have some type of academic standard or requirement. 21 of the 25 programs we looked at had an academic requirement. VMSDEP currently does not, and it does seem like at least financial aid programs at the state level, and I think at least some of the federal veterans benefit programs have some requirement there. So it's interesting that we were doing all this work kind of concurrently. So while we were doing this, we were getting some survey feedback, and this idea just kind of bumbled up through some comments from people who were, I don't know who they were, but we sent this out to the Joint Leadership Council, and so I'm assuming these were people that were either active duty or retired. But this concept bubbled up from some of that community as well. But it's anecdotal, just to be clear about that.
I just want to note that I have spoken to many stakeholders and many folks who have been involved in advocacy for this program, and academic performance, if you will, seems to be a widely acceptable proposal.
Interesting.
Even if you just tell the institutions that, even if you word it in a way where a student must meet the institution's definition of academic. I wouldn't say success, but there's
specific terms, and each school
performance.
thinks about it
Yeah,
slightly
a little
differently.
differently.
And Wendy and I had some chats about this, so it's a little complicated. But yes, I think that's I'm glad you said that, Madam Chair, because we asked schools if they could just count for us how many didn't meet as a given point in time their definition of good academic standing, and that varies somewhat by school, but it's something they decide. What's interesting here is it's not a huge number. So I do think doing this to kind of really reduce the cost of the program isn't really the reason
It's
you would
not
do
gonna
this.
reduce
It
it.
might be for the reasons you suggest. So
Colleagues, it's not going to really reduce the cost, because
probably right.
remember, universities want students to succeed. They want to have a good graduation rate in a reasonable amount of time, so many times they'll bring supports to students who are not in good academic standing. So I just wanted to throw that out. Go ahead, Mr. Brown.
So this is just an option to that effect, and we've got kind of a dollar scale on the bottom here, and just to point you that this would reduce program costs by a fairly small amount, we think. So going back to the other states, we noticed it's also fairly common to somehow factor in other available aid. There's different ways of doing this, but 17 of the 25 programs did that to some degree. And I do want to point out, it was made pretty clear to us when we interacted with some program participants and stakeholders that depending on how this is done, it's going to have implications for participants. Some folks kind of use the totality of funding available to them to provide or cover other costs for them, not just tuition and fees. And so if there's changes made to this, that'll need to be thought through carefully, and I think it will have implications for some students in terms of the funding that they use to kind of cover the full cost. Obviously, the waiver right now is just for tuition and fees. And so if you start kind of changing that, the calculus may change. So there could be a real impact on doing this. And at a minimum, it reduces the flexibility for some of the participants. Again, folks told us to kind of look into Texas. Texas does this. It's primarily the Chapter 33 benefits. It's hard to know how much this actually reduces their costs, but it is possible. But how you do it needs to be done carefully, and that's something I'm sure there's folks here could probably speak about this more intelligently than we could about the best way to do it. But it is something that the states do. So another idea, you could require something similar here, and it could work kind of like when somebody applies, DVS also tries to ask them what else they're eligible for, and then that information could get routed over to the institutions. And I thought, I chatted with a gentleman after the governor's task force meeting who made an excellent point that it would probably make sense to, between Chev or the institutions, like help that person find every available federal dollar available to them, and kind of everybody wins. So I thought that was a useful idea. Another possible thing you could do is some states cover graduate education, but some don't. 10 to 25 we looked at cover graduate education. Now I mentioned it's been growing. I mean, it's still a pretty small percentage, but it's been growing quickly. And obviously it costs more. This is just an example for a degree at ODU, undergrad versus grad, and graduate costs more on a semester basis. So you could just limit this program to undergraduate programs only. That would start to reduce the cost by a little more. As I think I said this before, but 13% last year of the waiver impact was due to graduate degrees. So in terms of just the value of the benefit or the waiver itself, it's kind of mixed when you look at other states. So there's 11 of 25 that do a full waiver like Virginia. And in the note there's actually 4 that provide more than tuition and fees, which can be used for other higher education costs. And there's a way that, it's not many states, I think there's 4, but there's a few states that kind of give themselves some budgetary predictability, maybe some cost containment, and they just treat it like a grant program. So I think the example we have here is from Florida, that there's an amount appropriated, and that just gets divided by the number of program participants, and that's the benefit amount for that year. Ohio, Maryland, Colorado do something similar to varying degrees, but again, just showing Florida as an example here. So the next grouping of options are, you could think about this kind of in different ways, but part of this would be a way to try to provide some budgetary certainty to the legislature and the governor. You could set the waiver at a specific dollar amount. For example, the weighted average tuition across colleges is something that the College Savings Plan calculates every year. You could go with the Florida approach and just say this is how much we're providing, and we'll divide that by the number of participants. I think the challenge here is there's a point at which the benefit amount really drops a lot. And so that kind of has to be dealt with in terms of the impact on the recipient side of that. So, right now you can be eligible in Virginia with a 90% disability rating. And that wasn't a huge, if you think back to the slide a while ago, I think it was about 13 or 14% of all enrollment. So it's not a huge percentage, but it's not terribly common to do that. I think there was 6 of the 25 programs that offer eligibility at the 90% disabled rating. It's very common to do 100%. I think I said that earlier. Virginia does that also, obviously. This was another idea that just kind of bubbled up on the survey. Just wanted to pass those along to you and to our members. Again, no quantification here. This is just anecdotal comments. So we've got 3 ways the legislature could think about this if they wanted to do something here. The first would be to keep 90% disabled as an eligibility category and just provide a lesser benefit amount. The second would be to keep 90%, but there's a specific designation that the federal VA provides. It's called individual unemployability, and that is a certification that you are not able to work. And so one idea would be to kind of require that. You could just remove the 90% category altogether, but again, emphasizing that if you were to do that, you need to think very carefully about who's already been certified and kind of what the downstream effects of doing that. So back to that effective date issue. So another part of this is kind of the connection to Virginia and how other states think about that. And this is also a little mixed. About half of the programs require a tie to the state. So when they entered service, I believe this gentleman was talking about entering in Texas. Virginia does that as well. There's some states that don't focus as much on that. They focus more on being in the state for a certain period of time. Virginia kind of does both. You know, and it's interesting when we were talking to people about this. We weren't paying attention to this at the time. I don't know if this was the intention or not, but there's some people that have told us that they moved here for this benefit. And on the one hand, from an economic development perspective, and I mean, that's a good thing. So I do think if there's going to be some changes made to the residency requirement in particular, it's probably worth talking about what do you want this program to achieve, and do you want people coming here to use the program?
Question. In one of our earlier presentations, it seems to me, I thought we had a 5-year residency requirement. Is that still?
It's 5 years. It's domicile, not residency. Is that correct? Domicile? Residency. Okay, so 5-year residency. At one point, it was 10, I think.
Yes, it was.
Other states do it somewhat differently. Just to be transparent, there's a few states that it's just 1. And so you can make the case that Virginia's 5 is actually a little bit more stringent. So I think that is what it is now. It's 5 years. It was 10 a long time ago.
I just think that should be a public point. Okay, thank you.
So kind of the same theme we had here on the 90%. You could kind of make it a little bit harder to qualify here, and so you'd go to domicile instead of physical presence. That's what I was grasping for. You could extend it from 5 years to something more than that. To be candid, we picked 15 because we thought that in terms of when a family may try to get eligibility for their child, that time period kind of pushes you well in advance of that. There's nothing magic about 15 years, but you could also eliminate the requirement altogether in terms of moving in. But again, really need to think about the effective date of that if that's something you wanted to do. Finally, for the groupings of options we have here, is this notion of service-related rather than combat-related eligibility. And this was a fairly recent expansion, as you can see in that second bullet there. It's been a pretty big component of the growth. What's a little bit different here in terms of this notion, I think you would do this if you really wanted to kind of reduce the fiscal impact of the program. As I've said, it's fairly common for other states to provide this. I think you need to think about that carefully. So removing that in Virginia would kind of be pretty inconsistent with how the other states who have these types of programs think about that. So here's just some ideas about how to do it. Again, you could keep it as a category, but provide a lower benefit amount. You could also remove it altogether, but that would be a big change to the program. So I will just wrap up with kind of a, let's say, split the difference type of option here. Obviously, this is a important program. It's a tough issue, and I think just 2024 really demonstrates the level of stakeholder concern about the program, how important it is. And so, we tried to take a step back and figure out if we could kind of straddle both parts of that sustainability equation. And one way to think about it would be to make the benefit more flexible from the beneficiary's perspective. Right now, it's a waiver of tuition and fees, which is very valuable, but that's all it can be used for. You can't use it for other higher costs like room and board or even other fees, or if you're living off campus and have to buy your own food, you can't use it for that. So you could make it more flexible, but you could kind of give a little more budgetary certainty by providing a lower amount there. So more flexibility in terms of how the recipient spends it, but at a lower dollar amount. Again, we there's the weighted average tuition number. You could go lower than that and use the tag grant number, which is pretty low. That's like $5,200, I think. So this was just a formal option here. And there's a lot of ways to, I think, kind of pull from what we've talked about to do this same type of thing where there's kind of a compromise if that's something folks want to do. So this just summarizes everything I've told you, and I will stop there.
I just have a question, maybe it's a comment. I was reading some higher ed report, and in that report, it noted that about 70% of our undergraduates actually stay in the state and contribute to the economy. They become fully employed. Some of them go on to graduate school or professional school, but many of them stay in the state, continue to work and contribute to our tax base and our economic growth. Do you have any statistics or anything on what our VMSDE recipients, do they end up staying in the state after they graduate or after they use their scholarship, if you will?
That is a good question. I think there is some data to be pulled from different places and try to make an estimate of that. We didn't try to do that. One way to maybe think about it is if that 70% is correct, would folks who are participating in this program be more or less likely to leave or stay? You can make a case either way, perhaps. I think also what degrees are these people getting, and is that something that the state really needs? So, for example, if you're in a critical shortage area, you may stay here. But I'm not sure. I don't want to put Lee on the spot, but that would be tricky to do. I think that'd be very difficult. Okay, so our methodologist said it'd be very tricky to do. But in terms of the other benefits to the economy from participants in that program, if a lot of them stay, that's a good thing if we need.
I mean, I just think if we're looking at sort of the cost and the participation rate, we might as well look at the future and what the recipients are contributing.
Mm-hmm.
I expect it would be tricky, but universities would be able to keep track.
I think that's true, but I will just say we've done a lot of higher ed work, but some track where people go and some don't. It's kind of mixed, but what would you want to add to that? This is our methodologist, Eric Beecroft, by the way.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One thing we could do potentially would be a little bit of a lift is to get data from the Virginia Employment Commission, wage data. They keep wage data for about 85% of working people in Virginia. And so we can match that to VMSDEP participants if we can get Social Security number and thereby tell what percentage of VMSDEP graduates are working in Virginia and what their wage levels are. But that's not a little thing to do, but it is possible to do.
I know it is a heavy lift, and maybe as we continue to come up with ways to make sure this program is better coordinated so we understand it better, so we can maybe manage it in a way that makes a little bit more sense than what we're doing now. I think it's information that might be helpful to us. Colleagues, did you have a question? Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Brown. Next on our agenda, Wendy Kang, are you prepared to go ahead and give us a summary of our work group meetings?
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. As Madam Chair said at the beginning, we'll just provide a brief overview and summary of our meetings so far. As you heard through the Chair's comments, that this select work group was formed in June at the request of the Chair. And at the same time in June, we also, or I think it's a little bit later after, had requested JLARC to have an independent review and to look at options, of which you've just heard about today. Just as a reminder, through the meetings that we had, the first meeting that we provided was staff presentations and gave an overview of the VMSDEP program as well as federal education benefits. So those materials are still available on our website and describe some overviews. And then at the next meeting, we were able to invite subject matter experts from the various agencies that work with the program. So the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors, that was explaining more about the federal benefits, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia. And then finally today, we've got the presentations from JLARC and our staff summary of what's taken place so far. As the chair mentioned, we had public comment at each time through online forms, and I'll have a QR code that's after this slide to allow individuals to be able to submit written comment. That is through an online form, and we will be able to provide those comments back to individuals. We also have a moment for in-person public comment after this for the public to continue to provide feedback to us. As Katie mentioned, the public comment, which is available through this QR code, is also on the agenda for those who are following online. There's a link provided through that will remain open through November 12th until midnight, so all the way through to the end of the day on the 12th. And with that concludes my summary. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Wendy. Colleagues, do you have any questions? Senator DeStefano.
I still have some unanswered questions, but I'll wait till we get them from everybody. I know it's been 60 days since I've asked some of them, but even at the last JLARC meeting, we had a few additional questions that were asked and still unanswered. So I'm looking forward to actually seeing the answers to those. I'm going to make a couple of statements before the public comment because I want to make sure that my position is well articulated and well known here. I believe a promise made is a promise kept. We promised this program to our military members. We need to keep that promise. I believe that we are trying to attract and retain our military and their families to Virginia after they're injured, retired, etc. They're a large part of our workforce, specifically in Hampton Roads and in Northern Virginia. We've received awards for the way we've run this program for the last 3 years. Our goal for this program, when it comes to number of participants, we've not met our goal yet. Our goal is still 9,000, then we bumped it up to 12,000 members. So we've not met our goal that we've put out nationally, that we've won national awards for on running this program. I think that when we say certain things like a 15-year to stay here and then you're eligible, well, our military members are required, most of them, to move every 3 to 5 years or 2 to 3 years, depending on your service and your MOS or your career track. So it's kind of difficult for somebody to say, hey, we're going to stay here for 15 years straight. On slide 61, I think I pointed this out at the last JLARC meeting, but where we talk about Chapter 33 benefits, Chapter 33 is the GI Bill, and not everybody eligible for this program have access to the GI Bill or GI program. So we need to make sure that when we're going through this, we truly understand this. This is a program that I believe when we put this out, and we've been, I don't want to say marketing or advertising, but we really push this program because it's the right thing to do. We want to do everything we can for those who we promise, as in our law enforcement, our first responders, hey, if you die in the line of duty, we're going to take care of college for your kids because you're no longer going to have that income coming into your family. It's the exact same for our military. These individuals, a lot of them, the spouses are now required to provide all of the nursing and care for this individual who, trust me, if you're a military member and you're injured, you don't want to be injured. Most of them are type A personalities like me. You push through everything. You don't want to have to rely on somebody to take care of your daily needs because you want to be a participant to the family income, to the family unit. It's embarrassing for a lot of our members that they're no longer a participant. They're relying on their spouse, their family to take care of them. And that's why I go back to my opening comment, which is a promise made is a promise kept. And I'm going to make sure that we push forward and keep that promise, or do everything I can to ensure we keep that promise. This is not a lot of money. And if you look at our budget, this is a rounding error. This is what we call budget dust. It's not that big of a deal. So, and that's in my opinion. It truly is a rounding error. And we've not met our goal of the program yet, which is 12,000 individuals. So, and our university professors, I've talked to a majority of them who all agree that this is a great program. They want to do everything they can to continue this program. And I think we should do everything we can to help support them in the continuation of this program. And that's what I have, Madam Chair, and thank you for allowing me to trespass on the committee's time.
Thank you, Senator DeStefan. And I just want to make it clear, it has been my goal, and I have had enormous help from my colleagues, that we approach this with the utmost respect for the service that our veterans have given to the country and that they continue to give to the Commonwealth. We want to honor that. We also want to be in a position where we can always support that service through the VMSDE program. So we do have to look at common sense fiscal options. You would want us to. We're also in charge of managing state revenue and taxpayer dollars. So we have to look at all sides, but this committee in no way wants to diminish the commitment we've made to our veterans. We merely want to manage the program in the best possible way. Before we move to public comment, I'm going to ask Senator Rome. She is putting in I think you put in a draft for a bill this year which will reflect the recommendation from JLARC. The one recommendation which had to do with coordination between the Department of Veterans Affairs and SHEV. So go ahead, Senator Rome. Why don't you inform folks so they are not surprised that when the session starts, they'll know about this bill. Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, Madam Chair, the draft that we received back from Division of Legislative Services is a Section 1 bill that says that the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia shall, in coordination with the Department of Veterans Services, submit to the Senate Committee on Finance and Appropriations, the House Committee on Appropriations, by December 15th, and the House Committee on Appropriations, by December 15th of each year, a report on Romanet 1, the number of individuals who are qualified survivors and dependents, and that term is defined in Section 23.1-608 of the Code of Virginia. And as such, and this is the part where the original draft we got is going to have one edit here in consultation with DVS and SHEV, where the draft we got says are eligible for participation in this program. The different language that we're going to be using there on that request is, hold on one second, it is, we're going to strike the word are and we'll say have been certified as eligible. That was a request that came out of a joint meeting with DVS and SHEV so that we could make sure that we have stakeholder agreement on this and understanding. So in good faith, we are putting that in. And they'll say who have been certified as eligible for participation in the Virginia Military Survivors and Dependents Education Program, the program, but are not yet admitted to a public institution of higher education in the Commonwealth, and Romanet 2, the best available estimate of the total cost of qualified survivors and dependents as that term is defined in Section 23.1-608 of the Code of Virginia, who are participating in the program and enrolled in the fall semester at each public institution of higher education in the Commonwealth. Once we have the final draft that comes back from DLS that includes the requested amendment, I'll be sending that to my colleagues here on the work group. So make sure everyone has a chance to review that final language. I'll then, assuming everyone signs off and I check around and, just basically, put my reporter skills to work and see if there's any opposition. I don't expect any, but if there is, I'll then file the bill. I'll then send bipartisan requests for co-patrons for that to make sure that everyone knows that this is something that the work group supports in its entirety. And then we will present the bill in committee and the legislative process will take over from there. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Rome. We think that recommendation can only help us manage the program and understand perhaps the fiscal impact in a timely fashion. So this should be a very good move. And thank you, JLARC, for coming up with that recommendation. Okay, it's now time for public comment. So those who wish to speak, I would ask you to please follow our Senate rules, which do require civility and not naming senators by name and being as professional as possible. And I'm sure everyone here will abide by those rules. We will put a timer on for 3 minutes and ask you to honor that as well. So please give us your name, and if you're representing an organization, tell us that as well.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Mark Maggio. I am a veteran and served our country for 31 years on active duty and in the Army Reserves and did 3 combat tours. I am currently the Junior Vice Commander of the Veterans of Foreign Wars Department of Virginia. The Commonwealth of Virginia has 129 VFW posts and 34,000 members, including auxiliaries. I've been asked by our state commander, Mitch Rubenstein, to thank the Virginia General Assembly for restoring and funding the Virginia Military Survivor and Dependents Program earlier this year. This program is an important promise Virginia made to veterans and the families of our fallen and disabled military personnel. Maintaining the Virginia Military Survivors and Dependents Program is a top priority of the VFW, and we look forward to working with the General Assembly and the Governor to ensure the program's long-term viability. Thank you.
I appreciate your comments. I do appreciate the constructive conversations I've had with some of you on this program, so thank you. Yes, sir.
Yes, ma'am. Madam Chairman, Monty Zimmerman, VFW Virginia. I'm the legislative chair for the state, and I'm a 30-year, 9-month military retiree. And the first point to Senator DeSteff's comment is that we definitely stayed in Virginia because of this program. I was considering moving to Texas. As I told you, I'd deployed from Texas, and my daughter was eligible to use the Hazelwood Act because of that. But my family here, my son stayed and is now a lieutenant in the Virginia Army National Guard after graduating from George Mason University with a bachelor's degree through the VMSDEP program. And he intends to have a long-term career in Virginia. And so anecdotally, there's at least one person that I can say that used the program that intends to be a productive member of Virginia society. So thank you so much for everything that you've done, for all that it took to go through everything while we worked through the importance of this program to the veterans. And at the Governor's Commission, and I'm a member of the commission as well, the universities collectively said that this program provides maturity and great input from the students that help the student bodies as a whole from the universities. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman. Welcome.
The timer was wonderful. My watch is broken. Hi, my name is Caitlin Goodale Porter. It's my honor to be here again, and I really do want to start with a thank you as well. I really appreciate how well and responsibly Virginia has reacted to this crisis. As a female veteran of both the Army and the Coast Guard and a military spouse, I want to let you know that women sometimes carry more than their fair share of the family's issues. And we have a situation right now, post-pandemic, where the suicide rate for female veterans is going up at nearly 4 times that of men. Frankly, I think what has happened with VMSDEP put me really close to that line. And it had already been a struggle to deal with the federal VA, where we are not making any headway on what they deliberately do to scrape every penny off of dual military families that they can. They cut corners egregiously. They know they're violating both the Constitution and federal case law, but they continue to do it because they're bigger than we are. Whereas what we found in Virginia is this is a state. You all have been incredibly responsive. And I want to tell you that the wonderful thing that I took away from the governor's task force meeting in October, is that this could be the flagship program in the entire country. We don't really need to keep considering what Texas does or what Florida does, in my opinion. We need to say we have a darn fine program to begin with. Let's make it the best out there. Let's make sure that veterans and their family members, especially survivors, feel that they are truly welcome here forever, or else we will lose people. Right now, graduate school actually, I think, enhances that. I have a student in our family who will be shortly getting a master's degree in social work. She will be licensed in Virginia, therefore she will stay here. Our younger daughter is not a graduate student, so maybe she'll go somewhere else. But in the meantime, let me tell you, when this program started in 1930, it allocated $150 per student. I found that going through some old emails with a law librarian. It's never going to cost that little. It's going to cost money, but it's what I think of as a lost leader. We entice, not bribe, but entice Virginians or people to stay here and become Virginians, and we end up with taxpayers. We end up with people who tell other people about this program and they love their state. I loved my state until this catastrophe blew up in my face, and right now I'm a little jaded. I'm not so sure. But I would love to have my trust restored, because a promise made should be a promise kept. And the people who have truly responded well to us, we absolutely appreciate that. So some materials I'm leaving with you. Do not let us become North Carolina. North Carolina requires that the child be born in that state and live their entire life there. How the heck does that work when your parent is a Marine and gets orders for Okinawa or California or Virginia? Those kids are told, thank you for your service, but not really, to the parent or the family. We can do better because we have a better program to begin with. Let's make it the best. Thank you.
Is there anybody present who would like to come forward and make a comment? Okay, I guess that concludes our public comment. Colleagues, is there anything that I should say that I haven't? Have I neglected to make any important announcement? No, okay. Staff, have I forgotten to say anything that needs to be articulated? Okay. Once again, we will accept written public comment from now through November 12th, which is next Tuesday. All comments will be read and shared with members. Thank you for the stakeholders and all who have participated in this process and helping the committee weed through the numerous pieces of information and better understand the program and the participants who have benefited from the program. It has been enormously gratifying to work with you all, and we thank you. And colleagues, this does conclude our efforts as the Select Committee. So we have done our work and we're finished. Thank you. I move that the meeting be adjourned. Thank you.
The Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia.